Hello and welcome to this edition of One on One. I'm Paranjoy Thakurta in the studio of Lok Sabha television here in New Delhi, and in this edition of the program we're going to look at the Great Recession. Is the recession over? Or are we really going to see a double dip recession? Is it going to be double dip? Is it going to be WWW? Is it just one more business cycle? Or is it the worst crisis the planet has seen in more than 7 decades? What does this mean? What is the future of capitalism? Is it a crisis in the system? Is it a crisis of the system? And at the end of the day, what do countries in Asia, what does a country like India, what are the lessons that we need to learn from what has happened across the globe? Let me welcome to the studio a very, very old friend of mine. I'm meeting him after a quarter of a century. We studied in college together, Dr. Anoop Rai, Professor of Finance, Hofstra University, Hempstead, New York. Also the Director of the Center for International Financial Services and Markets, which is located at the Hofstra University, whose mission is to promote and facilitate the study of international financial services and markets. So that's the reason you're going to talk about these subjects, and for the benefit of our viewers, Professor Rai studied at the University of Delhi and then went on to do an MBA from Notre Dame and then a PhD from Indiana, and published widely, teaches at various educational institutions, including the Indian Institute of Management at Kolkata, at Rotterdam, and in Sicily, in Singapore, in Netherlands. Thank you so much, Anoop, Professor Rai, for coming here.
Thank you.
The first question, everybody is very worried that this double dip recession is going to happen, that we might see something close to what happened in 2008 again in 2012. A recently released report of the United Nations, the first line says that the possibility of another economic crisis, a double dip recession, is real. It's possible. The World Bank is saying something. So how bad is bad?
I wouldn't use the word bad as much as uncertain, because we have to, if you look back, this is the second biggest recession after the Great Depression, correct? So if we want to learn any lessons, or we want to look and see how things change after a deep recession, it was somewhat of a global recession, the only comparable point we have is the Great Depression.
And that's in the late 30s.
Things were a little different, but again, we see, if you were to look back at that period, it doesn't look very promising, let me put it this way, because it takes a lot to get out of a recession, and it takes a lot to get out of a great recession that is in a globally interconnected world. And yet, I'm not going to use the word double dip recession yet, because I do believe we are living in a different world. We have a lot more coordination among countries, among central banks.
And the group of 20 is playing a more proactive role, if I may suggest?
Thank you. For the first time, yes. Because if you know, during the interwar years, it was not a team spirit. There was no team spirit those days. Each country was on its own. So we have learned a lot. I'm very happy to see that there's a lot more collaborations going on. So on that note, what will ultimately decide whether there's going to be a double recession or double dip recession, or something that will continue to go up and down, or whether, if you're lucky, we just move up.
Okay. Let me stop you here, Anoop.
Okay.
Let's look at what are the key differences between what happened in 2008, the meltdown that took place on the 15th of September, Wall Street collapsing, Lehman Brothers going under, AIG going under, etc., to what is happening now. Eurozone is in a deep sovereign debt crisis. And it's not just Greece and Italy and Ireland and Portugal and Spain. Standard & Poor's is downgraded, even France. The point is, there seems to be no resolution in sight to the very, very deep sovereign debt crisis which is in Europe. Now, if you look at the US and the Eurozone as a whole as two of the world's biggest economies, and they are also intimately interconnected, so the crisis in one would feed on the other. So if 2008 it was America, this time round it's Europe.
Correct. And the problem is that this crisis was in the making what's funny to say is that even without a big crash in the U.S., Europe was on its way down because the same story. They had got themselves into debt through various means, but they also have a lot of promise payments to be made, both in terms of pension and other social benefits to their citizens, which was fine when they were growing post-war, right up to, let's say, the late 70s. But after that, things have turned around, and economists have realized that they are overextending themselves. The crisis in the U.S. created a global crisis, and in that respect, Europe suddenly found itself. What was hidden under the radar, basically, just exploded. And now they've realized that they've got too much debt and they've got too much obligations, less tax revenues, and as a result, they are now, as you said, leading the way into what potentially could be a double dip, but hopefully
you are cautiously optimistic that it won't happen, but time alone will tell. In 2008, it was Iceland that went under. One of its banks had a bigger debt than the entire country as a whole. This time round, it's been Greece. But the prescriptions, the so-called austerity measures that have been suggested, are going to be proved to be, have already proved to be immensely unpopular. And we've seen people out on the streets. We are seeing different forms of protest now spilling onto the streets. It's not just Occupy Wall Street, a few sort of crazy anarchists occupying a park in New York near Wall Street. But you're seeing, at least in Europe, in Greece, what you saw was large numbers of people are out on the streets. And it seems to me that it's going to be politically very difficult for many of the Eurozone countries to implement those austerity measures. And even if an attempt is made, it's going to lead to a huge amount of social unrest. Your views?
Correct. The prescription for austerity right after a crisis is, in my opinion, the wrong solution. We have seen this over and over again. The interwar years, I always go back to my favorite interwar years. Each country abandoned the others and instead went into a clampdown mode, trying to salvage for its country and then doing it at these expenses of cutting employment, cutting spending. On the other hand, what we have to do is we have to be careful how we spend. We have a lot of criticism now on Obama's spending spree, saying that it's not working. And yet, as economists, you and I, we know it's very difficult to gauge what's the right number because we always have to...
We economists have been trashed. I mean, we have become a despicable breed of professions. We are being held responsible for much of the problems of the world.
True. Maybe S&P is probably a little bit more off target than we have been, but it is difficult, Thak. It's not easy to estimate. How do you come out with numbers that predict if I spend 100 million, do I generate enough to keep it onto the upward track? Where is the optimal amount?
What's the ideal fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP? We've had this so-called Washington consensus saying it should be 3%, 4%.
Right.
But today you have these very guys who've been talking about the need to tighten your belt, themselves in deep debt.
Exactly. So, and remember, these debts should always be temporary, right? We say you can even go up to 8% as long as you can rein in back at some point if you can jumpstart the engine. But we don't seem to be able to do it, or we may. We don't know yet. You said Ireland is finally coming back on its feet in a way. So at some point we will take off. But getting back to the issue of economics, it's an inexact science. It's half science, half art. We are still in the infancy of understanding. I mean, Adam Smith was 1850s, correct? So it's only been 150 years. These are huge problems. So getting back to the issue, in terms of the spending, whether it will solve the problem or not, but if it was me, I would prefer spending rather than not spending.
Okay. Now, there's no consensus on this issue.
Correct.
Yes. You can say this, and the United Nations can say this. It's premature to withdraw or suddenly withdraw, the spending measures or the incurring a higher deficit to try and prime the economy. The old, good old, you talked about Adam Smith, this is good old John Maynard Keynes saying, you know, in a recession, it's important to put money in the pockets of people, even if they are digging holes and putting them back again. You know, I'm sort of exaggerating to make a
But
point.
you're right.
But the whole idea was to spend. But we do not see any consensus, certainly in the Eurozone countries, and even in the United States. I mean, there is no political consensus on the kind of economic policy measures that are required in this at this particular juncture.
Right, but what is where do we draw the line? I mean, the reason we don't have a consensus is in the U.S. we have a exact split in the political spectrum here. So you're never going to get an agreement on that. So even if we economists were to prove that spending is better than not spending, it's never going to get through. And with all this rhetoric that gets thrown in, am I suggesting that we spend our way out? No, the answer is not. Investments, like you said, one of the brick and mortar kind of jobs, is that the right thing to do in a recession? Perhaps. I'm more inclined to believe that will work rather than the other way around. You know, the U.S. spent billions in bailing out banks, but they have not spent enough. And they're not willing to spend enough on the welfare.
Jobs?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you know, Anoop, you've made a number of points, and I want you to step back a little bit and look at what really led to the economic crisis in the US, which spread like cancer across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what were the origins of the so-called subprime economic crisis, you know, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and then how did it kind of spread through the system? I think I want you to talk a little bit about that, and as a good professor, I want you to explain the intricacies of why what happened. But before that, Anoop, I need to take a break in my program, and I'm going to get back to you. We're looking at the Great Recession, the international financial crisis, the international economic crisis, the likes of which the world has not seen in 7 decades and longer. What are the lessons that we need to learn? What are the lessons that we here in India, what are the lessons that the world needs to learn? Can the group of 20 countries really be able to coordinate policies to ensure that we don't really get into a double dip recession? We'll be back with you in a short while from now. Stay with us. Welcome back to this discussion on the Great Recession. With me here in the studio of Lok Sabha Television, I have Professor Anoop Rai. He's Professor of Finance at Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York. His research is focused on international banking, financial markets. He's been widely published in various journals, academic journals. Anoop, if we look at the origin of the crisis, and most people attribute it to the fact that you had this housing boom, which was very artificial, because the great American dream was all about owning a house and a home. And America was the only country in the world where you could actually go and get into a ready-made home by paying upfront an amount which was maybe 1% or 2% or 3% of the total value of the home. It was all very fine if the values of the property kept going up. So even if you were a so-called ninja, no income, no jobs, no assets, it was all very fine. And you had these two organizations set up during Roosevelt's New Deal, your Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, which would underwrite everything. Mm-hmm. And then this big asset bubble burst. How? Why?
As you know, I teach a course on financial crisis and public policy.
So it's difficult for you to summarize it in a few minutes, but try.
So especially if you start from 1600s to 2008. But if you want one word or a couple of words to underline the different factors that played into this, what ended up being a perfect storm, as put by Reinhardt, is corporate greed, I think, would be the one word.
Corporate greed,
yeah.
Okay.
American corporate culture, it seems to have taken a twist. Really, it has moved into a mode where everything else does not matter except profits and short-term profits at that.
You are attributing systemic failures to the venality and the greed of a few dirty investment bankers in Wall Street.
Not just dirty investment bankers, a whole range of people. The head of Fannie Mae, the head of Freddie Mac, who are supposed to make sure that these loans were, of good quality that they could pass on to Wall Street. The broker who sold these ninja loans to people and saying that, take this loan even though you cannot afford it. Don't worry, the house prices will go up. They were making a commission. It seems like everything relied on people making money. The ratings agencies, they were stamping them AAA but taking money from these companies.
Your Moody's and your Standard & Poor's and all these guys.
All of these, the underlying factor common is the money that came in as a result. So you have the rating agencies, you have Freddie and Fannie that were supposed to scrutinize these loans and say approved and send it on. You had the bankers, brokers that were making these loans in a market that was going up. You had politicians to some extent insisting that these loans be made or mortgages be encouraged for election purposes. And at the end of the day, you ended up with a classic what happened in the 29s too.
You had the signs of something like this happening when in the 80s you had a savings and loan crisis, but you sort of failed to read the writing on the wall. Mm-hmm. And many people argue that when in America the sort of dividing line between traditional banking, where you borrow money from large numbers of people, you loan monies to large numbers of people. The difference in the two interest rates is your so-called spread, your margin, and you have a so-called bank which is just engaged in maximizing profits or returns to high net worth investors. I mean, and you'd still call yourself a bank. And when the dividing line between these two kinds of financial institutions got completely blurred or obliterated, that was the root of the crisis. Would you agree with this kind of analysis?
Yeah, you hit the point correctly. I have to caution you, though, that for every time we say that profits were one of the reasons, greed was one of the reasons, there are, of course, studies that also point to facts that seem to contradict this. For example, when I talked about corporate greed in the CEOs of bank, a lot of the banks during the crisis lost a lot of money. Lewis at Bank of America, I think, had options worth 190 million, ended up with very little money. Lehman's Fold had up to $1 billion. So you would say, is it rational for them to take the risks and therefore jeopardize all the earnings? My answer, after having said that, is that it's still yes. Greed did play a role, and they wanted to make more money than what they did. So to get back to that, the separation of investment banking from commercial banking, which was done in 1999, under the because we established the Glass-Steagall law in 1934 because of the 1929 crisis.
And this was during Clinton's time?
Yes, it was during Clinton's time. There was intense lobbying by both groups. To me, at this stage, as I like to point out, is there's no difference between the two parties when it comes to business law. The lobbies in the U.S. do control a lot of the agenda. There's, of course, countervailing lobbies, but at the end of the day, they seem to win. And this is one of them. Now, the economic studies...
And the same guys who are heading these big financial institutions on Wall Street, they're the same guys who end up heading the Federal Reserve, the regulatory authorities, including the Securities and Exchange Board, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they're the same guys who end up becoming Treasury Secretaries and so on and so forth. Correct. So it's one nice revolving door, the same bunch of guys.
We do have a problem with revolving door. I have a lot of my colleagues, friends who are in government, in Treasury, in private sector, so we can't blame them. But you're right, the revolving door is an issue. It's a question of incentives. If you are working in the Treasury and you want to get out of the Treasury and end up in a good job in Citibank, what's your incentive to do things that might hurt Citibank or be a tough regulator, etc. So without doubt, that is a factor. So you understand what I mean by there's so many different factors. So you start with the mortgages. You start with just to give you Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the CEOs. Now, this is technically a private corporation, but it's a semi-quasi.
Yes, that's right. It's like there's a huge amount of government support for these institutions.
And, the CEOs at some point in time are making $10 million, $12 million in bonuses. Look at the incentive. The more loans you sign, the more your bonuses. And you pass on that risk when the default occurs to the next 10 years wait. And that's what happened from 2000 onwards. We had these loans piling up. And the incentive structure is so bad that I think, whether they're well-intentioned or not, it comes to the point where they say, pass it on. But you reach a point where you say, how can you approve a no-income, no verification loan? I mean, isn't that absurd to think of any country allowing such a thing to happen?
Anoop, the point, these exotic financial instruments, derivatives, instruments that derive their value from other instruments, pieces of paper and then more pieces of paper being created out of more pieces of paper. And then one bright morning you wake up and find these pieces of paper are not even worth what you're... In America you don't have raddiwalas, but in your Indian raddiwala wouldn't give you. Yeah. So the creation of these exotic financial instruments, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, all sound very, very fancy. I think about half a dozen economists, some of them got Nobel Prizes for their work, and some of their firms went under too. Yeah. But wait, what you essentially had was the financialization of the economy. And as studies done by the Bank for International Settlements and others showed, between 2002 and 2007, that 5-year period, your quote-unquote shadow economy, that hot money, the unreal economy, became 10 times bigger than your real economy, your brick-and-mortar economy. And that sort of created the problems which resulted in the meltdown in 08 and 09.
Without a doubt. These instruments, which, by the way, as an educator and one who teaches these instruments, they are well-intentioned, and if used correctly, is a needed product in the economy of any country, because you need derivatives, companies need to hedge their receivables and payments. So there's very good things about these instruments. Credit default swap, for example, very good instrument. If you are a fund manager, you want to protect your investment, you buy a credit default swap. But what you saw was this spiraling and this trading that went on, and then the creation of these opaque instruments, that it takes me so long just to teach what a CDO is. And to find out that it has
How many hours would you take to teach your class what is a collateralized debt obligation or a credit default swap?
Yeah, 2 classes. I start with mortgage-backed securities and
2.5 hours
with a lot of math involved.
Blackboard filled with equations.
Correct. And to have that become a commoditized instrument where traders were selling it, they had no idea what it meant. All they knew was, I could buy it at 85 and sell it at 87. If you read some of the books, many of the traders from Deutsche Bank to Goldman Sachs who actually sold CDOs to another group of people, pension funds, whatever, had no idea what they were. All they knew was it was a good instrument. Mm-hmm. And without realizing that the underlying instrument backing all these were these mortgages. And then we find out these mortgages were totally worthless. They were made.
Anoop, I want you to explain, how did the cancer, these toxic assets, the toxicity spread from the mortgage housing loan market, the so-called subprime housing loan market, to Wall Street, the mainstream financial sector, and then across the globe? How did this process happen? How did this cancer spread?
Well, the term we use is financial engineering, and just to give
financial
you
engineering. Okay.
So
that's a pretty dirty phrase.
No, it's actually, it was a word that everybody said. If you were a financial engineer, you were smart, you were very quantitatively solid, and therefore we should hire you.
You had a fancy suite in New York. You would take vacations in Hawaii.
Very well paid jobs. Yes. But it all starts with the mortgage. And this whole crisis started with an average individual getting a mortgage from a bank, like you said, the earlier traditional banks. And the earlier traditional banks would keep their mortgages. They would know who their local people were because they couldn't go too far out of the bank. So the mortgages were all made locally, and the banks kept it, and life went on. But after a while, in the 80s, banks found out that they could actually package these mortgages, and whatever money they were receiving, there was another group that wanted it at the other end, and was also encouraged by the government. The government said, if you give it to them, I will also insure it for them, so they'll give you a better price for that. So we start this process of securitization, which at the beginning was very fine. It's good. It helps because the bank received new money, and they made more mortgages. Let's say a local community was expanding. You could get more money, and you could make more loans to that. Fine and dandy, till the group that had this on this side started getting impatient and said,
Greed.
That's one word we may use. It is, in a way. Again, I want to be
Oliver
careful.
Stone,
Yes.
this guy who was loosely modeled around Ivan Bosky's.
Yes.
The character who said greed is good, and we have a new version of Wall Street now. Yes, please go on.
Exactly. The problem is it? I would like to think that when it started, when innovations take place, it's well-intentioned. That they say, okay, you know what? This group I'm going to split into 5 tranches because the pension funds like when it's longer maturity, banks like it's shorter maturity. So I think I'm doing a good product by creating another product out of it. It's still the mortgage who's paying here. It comes to him, and then he passes it on to 4 different groups.
So when housing prices started coming down and those loans were not repaid, the cancer spread.
So it spread like this, but let's not forget, this were then sold to people, in fact, in towns in Norway that said, you know what, I get 25 basis points more. The Merrill Lynch office in Norway says this is a great product. You've got a certain amount of money, we'll give you a little bit extra. And is that considered greed? I don't know, for a town manager.
And that's how it spread across the economies of most of the 192 countries on planet Earth.
Yeah, because the other countries also started emulating the same products.
Right. Okay. Anoop, I need to take one more break in our program. I'm sort of halfway through our conversation. I have a number of things to talk to you about. I mean, what do the isms mean in today's day and age? What does capitalism mean? What does socialism or communism mean? The relevance of John Maynard Keynes or Jawaharlal Nehru. What are the lessons that we need to learn? What's the way forward? These are some of the questions I need to ask you. I'll be back with you. We're looking at the Great Recession, the recession which is not yet over. What are the lessons that all of us here we need to learn? Yes, greed. We know greed was one of the factors. But let's go beyond that. Let's look at whether this was a crisis in the capitalist system or a crisis of the capitalist system. We'll be back with you in a short while from now. Stay with us. Welcome back to our discussion on the Great Recession. With me here in the studio, my college friend, Professor Anoop of Hofstra University, New York. He's taught all over the world, at Rotterdam in the Netherlands, in Kolkata, in Sicily, in Singapore, conducted seminars on risk management to bankers from Russia, China, India, Netherlands, and so on and so forth. Anoop, our notion of modes of production have undergone a huge change. GM is a classic example. Government Motors, I believe, that's what they call it. No? It used to be called General Motors. It epitomized free enterprise capitalism. It used to employ 500,000 people once upon a time. It got bailed out by the government. Today, the government or the taxpayer of the United States is the biggest stakeholder in General Motors. You have here economies of the Scandinavian countries, which spend a huge proportion of their national budgets on healthcare, education, yet they don't call themselves socialists. We have China, which is about as capitalist can be. They call themselves communist.